Imagine being born into a palace of silk and gold, where every corridor whispered of power and every jeweled door led deeper into a labyrinth of secrets. To be a princess of the Ottoman Empire was to live surrounded by splendor, but also by shadows. Behind the marble walls of Topkapi, beneath the call to prayer that rose over Istanbul, a different kind of story unfolded, one not of triumph, but of terror. For these royal daughters, the most frightening night of their lives was not their father's wrath, nor the plotting of rivals in the harem. It was their own wedding night, because for an Ottoman princess, marriage was never simply a bond of love. It was politics in its most intimate form, a weapon sealed not with ink or blood, but with flesh. And as the palace doors closed behind her, and the silks were torn away, she understood. She was no longer her own. This is the story of why Ottoman princesses feared their first wedding night. A story of duty, of sorrow, of bodies used as bargaining chips, and of the silent endurance that left scars deeper than any sword. If you find yourself drawn into these darker truths of history, the moments too raw for textbooks, then subscribe, because here we walk the shadowed paths of power and pain that shaped empires. The palace was her cradle, her prison, and her inheritance. From the moment she opened her eyes, the Ottoman princess was wrapped in layers of silk and ceremony. Midwives whispered prayers over her newborn body. Eunuchs hurried through polished marble corridors to announce her birth, and scribes inked her name into the registers of empire. Yet even in that moment of celebration, her fate was already sealed. She was not simply a child. She was a daughter of the Sultan, and that title, though gilded, carried a weight that no crown could soften. Her childhood unfolded in a place most could only dream of entering. The Topkapi Palace rose like a jewel over the Bosphorus, its courtyards glittering with fountains, its halls heavy with the scent of rosewater and incense. Latticed windows allowed only fragments of the outside world to seep in, reminding her that beyond these walls stretched a city alive with merchants, mosques, and voices she would never truly know. For the harem, the world of the Sultan's women and children, was at once a sanctuary and a cage. The little princess learned early that eyes followed her everywhere. Eunuchs watched her steps with careful precision. Governesses corrected the way she held her head, the tilt of her chin, the cadence of her speech. She was taught to walk as though the ground itself bowed before her, yet never to forget that her steps were already mapped out by her father's will. To be a princess was to be adored in public, yet invisible in choice. She envied her brothers, though she rarely admitted it, even to herself. While she was taught the elegance of calligraphy and the rhythm of reciting poetry, they were taught the weight of the sword and the roar of command. They were destined to fight, to rule, to inherit the Sultan's power. She, too, was destined, but her destiny was softer, quieter, and infinitely more terrifying. Her worth would not be measured in battles won or provinces conquered, but in the alliances her body could secure. Whispers haunted the harem's corridors. Older women spoke of wedding nights with voices lowered to near silence, their words heavy with warning. She heard stories of cousins weeping behind closed doors, of uncles marrying their daughters to powerful governors only to watch them vanish into distant provinces, never to return. The little princess didn't yet understand the weight of these tales, but she understood the fear in their voices. Even in games with her handmaidens, when they played at dressing as brides and bridegrooms, laughter faltered at the thought of what those silken veils truly meant. Her father's shadow loomed larger with each passing year. Though he rarely entered the harem, his presence was everywhere, in the laws that bound her, in the eunuchs who carried his commands, in the unspoken knowledge that her fate lay in his hands. To be the Sultan's daughter was both blessing and curse. She would never know hunger, never wear rags, never beg for survival in the streets of Istanbul. But she would also never know freedom. There were moments of beauty, of course. Afternoons spent in gardens where tulips nodded in the spring wind. Lessons in music, her fingers trembling over the strings of the oud. The soft glow of oil lamps during storytelling nights, when old women spun tales of Scheherazade and her 1,000 nights of survival through words. But even in these moments, she felt a chill. The stories all circled back to the same truth. Women survived not by strength, but by endurance, by silence, by sacrifice. By the time she reached adolescence, the truth was no longer hidden. Marriage became a topic not of if, but when. She would overhear eunuchs speak of provinces restless under Ottoman rule, of governors who needed binding to the Sultan by more than law. And every time a province's name was mentioned, she felt a tremor in her chest. Was that where she would be sent? Would that be the land where her wedding night, the night whispered about in dread since childhood, would claim her? And so, though she still wore the silks of a child, though she still walked barefoot across carpets embroidered with flowers, her mind carried a weight far heavier than her years. She knew, in a way most children never should, that her life did not belong to her. It belonged to the empire, to the Sultan, to the man she would one day be given to. The little princess had not yet left her father's palace, but already, she was waiting for the night that would decide her fate. As she grew older, the palace began to feel smaller, though its courtyards stretched wide and its halls endless. Childhood had once made the gilded walls appear comforting, a world of glittering fabrics and sweet sherbets carried in silver trays. But now, as the years carved her into womanhood, those same walls began to close in like the sides of a tightening cage. The harem was no longer a playground. It was a waiting room, and every girl inside knew what they were waiting for. The lessons shifted as her body changed. The songs and poems were still there, yes, but they became secondary to lessons in silence, in obedience, in posture. She was taught how to stand beside a husband without overshadowing him, how to speak without giving offense, how to swallow words that burned like embers in the throat. The governesses reminded her that a single slip of the tongue could dishonor her father, could ruin an alliance, could undo a carefully crafted political marriage. Every smile, every bow of her head, every delicate flick of her wrist, it all became a kind of theater. And the stage she rehearsed for was the wedding night. At times, when she walked through the gardens at dusk, she would see her brothers sparring in the training grounds, their blades flashing under the torchlight. Their shouts of triumph echoed through the palace, full of life, full of purpose. She longed for even a fraction of that power. But when she voiced such thoughts to her nursemaid once, the woman shook her head and whispered sharply, "A princess has no sword. She has only her name, her silence, and her night." That phrase haunted her. Her night, as if everything she was could be reduced to one night. The moment when a man, likely older, perhaps even cruel, would claim her body as both bride and territory. Rumors of other princesses reached her ears. She heard of a cousin sent to a distant Anatolian fortress, married to a governor she had never seen until the veil was lifted on her wedding day. She heard of another, once beloved in the harem, who had died young, whispers saying her new husband had been brutal, her body too fragile to survive his demands. Each story was told in hushed tones, but the effect was the same. Fear seeped into her veins like ink through parchment. The rituals of daily life only sharpened this fear. The harem was filled with women, and though they smiled and laughed, the undercurrent was always sorrow. Concubines jostled for favor, mothers guarded their sons' futures, slaves whispered of punishments and exile. The princess often wondered if she was any different from them at all. She wore finer silks, yes. She was the Sultan's blood, yes. But like them, she was still a woman whose fate was determined by the desires and politics of men. Sometimes, when the moonlight fell over the Bosphorus and the call to prayer drifted across the water, she imagined slipping out of the palace, shedding her silks, disappearing into the streets as a nameless girl. But the thought never lasted long, for she knew, deep down, that there was no escape. To be the Sultan's daughter was not simply an identity. It was a sentence. Her mother tried to prepare her, though even her words were veiled. "A princess is strong not by choice, but by necessity," she told her one evening, her fingers threading through the girl's hair. "When the night comes, remember that you are not only a bride. You are the empire's promise." It was meant as comfort, but it only deepened the dread. By the time she reached her 15th year, she had begun to count the days differently. Every celebration, every festival in the palace gardens, every prayer recited at dawn felt like a bead on a string drawing her closer to the inevitable. Servants no longer looked at her as a child but as a bride in waiting. She could feel their gazes linger, full of quiet sympathy, as though they knew what awaited her better than she did. The air in the palace grew heavier with each passing season. The princess carried herself with grace, as she was taught, but behind her poise lay a trembling heart. She understood now why the older women spoke with such sorrow. She understood that childhood in the harem was only a rehearsal. The true play began on the night when her father's will would strip her of choice, when the silks would be replaced with bridal veils, and the doors would close behind her. And as she lay awake at night, staring at the carved ceilings of her chamber, one thought consumed her more than any other. She was afraid, not of death, not even of exile, but of that first wedding night. It began, as most things in the empire did, with whispers. At first, they were vague, threads of conversation she overheard from eunuchs shuffling down corridors, or scraps of gossip between older women in the baths. A name here, province there, words like alliance and stability and loyalty to the Sultan. At 15, she knew enough to understand what those words meant. They were not talking about her education anymore. They were talking about her marriage. The harem changed when negotiations began. The women around her moved with sharper glances, measuring, waiting, watching who entered her chamber and who left. She could feel it in the way her attendants carried themselves, softer, more cautious, as though she had already ceased to be their charge and had become a fragile relic they were preparing to hand over. The laughter she once shared with her handmaidens grew thin, hollow, fragile. They too had heard the whispers. The truth finally arrived not as a conversation, but as a decree. Her father, the Sultan, did not speak to her directly. He never needed to. His words came through an emissary, a stone-faced vizier who carried the message with the weight of law. She was to be wed. The name of the man was spoken, a provincial governor in his middle years whose loyalty had wavered in recent seasons. The marriage, she was told, would bind him to the empire. She was the seal. She listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap, her face carved into stillness as she had been taught. Inside, her chest burned with terror. She had never seen the man's face. She knew nothing of his voice, his temper, his kindness, or his cruelty. All she knew was that he was older, powerful, and waiting, and that her father's will had made him inevitable. The preparations began almost at once. Her chamber was filled with silks and embroideries, jewelers presenting necklaces that shimmered under lamplight, perfumers offering oils to scent her body. From the outside, it looked like celebration. From the inside, it felt like funeral rites. Every new gift was a chain. Every ornament placed on her body was another reminder that she was no longer her own. The dowry negotiations dragged on for weeks. She would overhear fragments, ships laden with grain, control of a district, promises of loyalty written into parchment that would outlast her body. Her virginity was the final, silent item on the table. Though no one dared to speak it aloud in her presence, she knew that was what her first night would prove. Not her love, not her happiness, but her worth as a daughter of the Sultan. At meals, she felt the stares of other women in the harem, concubines, wives of viziers, even slaves who scrubbed the marble floors. Their eyes held a complicated mix of envy, pity, and resignation. Some would have traded places with her for the jewels alone. Others knew better. They had seen too many princesses vanish beyond the palace walls, sent to lands where their beauty became a bargaining chip, their wombs a tool for cementing alliances. One evening, when the lamps burned low and the smell of jasmine hung heavy in the air, her mother visited her. The Sultan's consort had always been careful with words, never speaking openly of fear in front of her daughter. But that night, her eyes were rimmed red. She took the girl's hands in hers and whispered, "You are more than what they will make of you. Remember that, even when you cannot resist." It was the closest thing to comfort she had ever given, and it frightened the princess even more. The palace, once her entire world, now felt like a staging ground. She could hear the pulse of her own destiny in every echoing corridor. The sound of scribes sharpening their reeds was the sound of contracts sealing her future. The rustle of silk gowns was the sound of chains. Even the call to prayer from the minarets seemed to echo her surrender. And so the bargain tightened. She was no longer the Sultan's daughter in the eyes of the court. She was a treaty in waiting, a gift wrapped in brocade, a currency about to be spent. The day of her betrothal arrived like the slow advance of a storm, not sudden, but inevitable, heavy, suffocating. The palace had been preparing for weeks, its marble courtyards scrubbed to gleaming white, its fountains filled with rose petals, its kitchens thick with the smell of roasting meats and sugared almonds. Musicians tuned their instruments in the shadows, ready to drown unease with melody. To the outside world, it was a day of celebration. For the princess, it was the day she ceased to belong to herself. The rituals unfolded with ruthless precision. She was dressed in layers of silk so heavy she could barely breathe, her hair braided and wound with gold threads that cut at her scalp. Jewels rested against her skin, cold and unyielding, as though to remind her of the wealth she carried into this marriage. The women of the harem fussed around her like bees, smoothing fabrics, adjusting veils, painting her face until she resembled a porcelain idol rather than a living girl. Every gesture stripped her further from herself, replacing her with a symbol, a bride not of love but of empire. The contract was read aloud in the presence of viziers and envoys, words inked on parchment and sealed with the Sultan's tugra. Lands, ships, soldiers, and promises were exchanged in a language she had been raised to hear but never to question. Her name was spoken, not as a daughter but as property. When the final words were spoken, she understood that the ink on those pages carried more weight than her own voice ever could. The wedding procession began as dusk fell, torches flaring against the sky, drums echoing through the palace gates. Crowds gathered in the streets of Istanbul, cheering as the Sultan's daughter passed in her gilded carriage, veiled from view. To them, it was a spectacle, a display of wealth and power. To her, it was a funeral march. She looked through the thin fabric of her veil at the sea of faces, merchants, beggars, soldiers, children, and felt a pang of envy. Each one of them, no matter how poor, was freer than she was in that moment. Her husband-to-be rode at the head of the procession, a figure she glimpsed only briefly, his face half hidden by the shadows of the torchlight. Older than her father's youngest viziers, broad-shouldered, stern, his presence alone filled her with dread. She would not speak to him until after the ceremony. She would not truly see him until the night closed around them. In the great hall, surrounded by courtiers and musicians, the marriage was sealed. Incense burned so thick the air was difficult to breathe, the smoke curling around the golden arches above. The Qadi recited the verses, the blessings spoken in solemn tones, and the crowd erupted in celebration. Coins were scattered, music swelled, women ululated in piercing joy. Yet behind the noise, she heard nothing but the thunder of her own heartbeat. When her veil was lifted for a brief moment, so that the marriage could be witnessed, she forced her face into serenity, as she had been taught. Her eyes met his for the first time. There was no warmth in them, no curiosity, no tenderness, only calculation. He looked at her not as a man seeing a bride, but as a governor receiving territory. The chill of that gaze cut deeper than any blade. As the feast began, she sat beside him, smiling when expected, sipping sherbet that tasted of ashes. She watched dancers whirl across the marble floors, their skirts spinning like petals, their bodies free in movement. She felt envy again, sharp and bitter. Every laugh that echoed through the hall seemed to mock her silence. Every toast made to her future happiness felt like a cruel jest. The night stretched on, heavy with music and wine. But beneath the spectacle, she could feel the weight of what waited. When the musicians laid down their instruments, when the torches burned low, when the last of the revelers departed, the true ceremony would begin. Not the feast, not the contract, the night itself, the night she had feared since childhood, loomed ahead. And so, while the empire celebrated, the bride sat motionless in her gilded seat, her stomach clenched, her heart whispering the truth she dared not speak. This was not a union. This was surrender. The palace grew quiet after the feasting. The music had died, the laughter had faded, and the torches burned lower in their sconces. Servants scurried silently through the corridors, clearing away platters heavy with uneaten food and cups sticky with spilled sherbet. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sang, its voice lost in the hush of the Bosphorus breeze. The city outside still pulsed with life, but within the palace walls, everything narrowed to a single chamber, a single night. The princess was led by attendants, her body stiff beneath the weight of brocaded silks, her face hidden behind the layers of her bridal veil. They guided her through corridors lit only by oil lamps, the shadows stretching long and thin across the tiled floors. She could hear the sound of her own breathing echoing inside her chest, shallow and fast, though she tried to keep her steps measured, graceful as she had been taught. The chamber they brought her to had been prepared with ceremonial care. The bed was draped in crimson cloth, embroidered with golden tulips, symbols of empire, of eternity, of beauty that withers too soon. Incense burned thick in bronze braziers, filling the room with a heavy sweetness that made her head swim. Candles flickered along the walls, their flames trembling as though they, too, were afraid. Everything in the room glowed with splendor. Yet beneath that beauty lay a silence that pressed on her skin like iron. The women helped her undress, their hands deft but hurried, their faces expressionless. Each layer of silk that slipped from her shoulders felt like the tearing away of armor. By the time the last veil was lifted, she no longer recognized herself. She was bare, exposed, transformed into the bride that duty demanded. The women averted their eyes, retreating without a word. The heavy doors closed behind them, the echo of wood striking stone reverberating like the ceiling of a tomb. She was alone. Moments later, he entered. The man who was now her husband, governor, ally, stranger. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, the scrape of his boots against the floor announcing his approach before she saw his face. When he drew near, the candlelight fell across him. His features were stern, carved by years of command, his eyes hard as obsidian. He looked at her with neither cruelty nor kindness, but with possession. She was his now, as much as the lands he governed, as much as the soldiers who obeyed him. The silence between them was unbearable. She wanted to speak, to beg for gentleness, to remind him that she was human, not merely the Sultan's token. But her training bound her tongue. A princess did not plead. Princess endured. So she lowered her gaze, as if submission could shield her from what was to come. The rituals of the night were no secret to her. From childhood, she had overheard enough whispered warnings to know what would unfold. Yet knowing and living were different things. As he drew closer, every muscle in her body tightened with dread. The air grew hotter, heavier, until each breath felt like fire in her chest. She wanted to flee, to run back through the doors, down the corridors, into the gardens where she had once been a child. But there was no escape. The palace was a fortress, and her father's will was unbreakable. He reached for her, and the moment was as she had always feared. Not tender, not hesitant, but inevitable. The weight of his hand on her skin confirmed what she had known all along. Her body was not her own. It was currency, territory, the physical signature on a treaty that had already been written. Outside, the city slept under the watchful eye of the Sultan's palace. Ships swayed in the harbor, merchants dreamed of profit, soldiers dozed in barracks. Life continued, indifferent. But inside that chamber, a girl's childhood ended, replaced by silence, submission, and the knowledge that she had been sacrificed to empire. For the rest of her life, she would remember the smell of that incense, the stifling heat of the candles, the heavy press of the crimson silks against her skin. More than the pain, more than the fear, it was the weight of inevitability that crushed her. The sense that she was not living her own story, but one written centuries before she was born. And as the night consumed her, she understood. This was why the older women had whispered, why laughter had always faltered when children played at weddings. This was the truth that haunted every Ottoman princess. The first wedding night was not simply a passage into marriage. It was the death of self. Dawn crept through the latticed windows, washing the chamber in pale light. The candles had burned down to pools of hardened wax, the incense gone cold, its smoke lingering faintly like the ghost of the night before. She lay still beneath the heavy crimson sheets, her body aching in ways she had been warned of but never imagined. Her mind floated between exhaustion and disbelief. The silence of the chamber pressed on her ears until even the rustle of fabric sounded deafening. She did not weep. She had wanted to, her throat still burned with the weight of swallowed sobs, but tears, she knew, were dangerous. If the servants who entered the room in the morning saw her broken, it would travel through the palace like wildfire. And in the empire, weakness was remembered. So she forced herself to sit, to smooth her hair, to hold her body upright though it screamed at her with every movement. The attendants entered quietly, as if afraid of the air itself. They bowed low, carrying trays of sweetened milk and honey cakes, offerings to strengthen the bride after her night of transition. They avoided her eyes. Their silence told her everything. They knew what had happened. They had seen this before. To them, she was no longer the Sultan's daughter. She was now a wife, bound not by blood but by a man she barely knew. Behind them came the matron of the harem, an older woman with a face carved by decades of watching these rites repeat. She checked the sheets with brisk efficiency, her expression revealing neither surprise nor pity. The proof was there. The contract was sealed. The empire could rest assured of the governor's loyalty. The princess felt her stomach twist with shame, not because of what had happened, but because her most private pain was inspected like evidence of a transaction completed. Later that morning, she was dressed again, her body covered in fresh silks, her hair scented with rose oil to mask the smell of smoke and sweat that clung to her skin. She was led back into the courtyard, where women of the harem awaited her return. Their faces told stories without words. Some looked at her with pity, some with envy, others with indifference born of long familiarity. Each one had known, in their own way, a night like hers, and each one knew she could never go back to the girl she had been before. Her husband appeared later, speaking little, his tone brisk, already turning to matters of administration, as if the night had been nothing more than a duty fulfilled. She realized then with crushing clarity, for him it had been just that, an obligation, a sealing of loyalty, the possession of what was promised. There was no space in his eyes for tenderness, no recognition of the dread that still knotted in her chest. She was an alliance, not a companion. Days passed, and the weight of the night did not lift. It followed her in every step, in the way the servants now bowed differently, in the way eunuchs addressed her not as a princess but as a governor's wife. The shift was subtle but unrelenting. The palace had a way of erasing what came before. Childhood dissolved overnight. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no return. At night, when the chamber doors closed again, the dread did not vanish, thickened. Though the first night had been the most terrifying, each one that followed carried its own quiet violence, the slow erosion of her identity. What frightened her most was not the pain, but the numbness that threatened to take its place. She feared the day when she would no longer tremble, when she would no longer resist inside her heart, when she would accept her fate not as tragedy but as routine. The harem whispered about her, of course. They always did. Her attendants passed along tales in secret corners. Some said she bore her new role with stoic grace, others that she was fragile, fading, like a tulip cut too early. But she spoke little. She carried herself with the same posture she had been taught as a child, though now it felt less like discipline and more like armor. And so, the first night became not just a memory but a shadow. It followed her through the corridors, through the gardens, even through her prayers. It was the night that had stripped her of self, that had branded her as pawn, wife, possession. It was the night that every Ottoman princess had dreaded, and for her, it was no longer a story whispered in the harem. It was her life. The fate of an Ottoman princess was never hers alone. Her wedding night may have seemed like a personal tragedy, a single life bent beneath the weight of a stranger's hands. But in truth, it was only one thread in a vast tapestry of empire. From the gilded heart of Istanbul to the restless provinces along the empire's farthest borders, these marriages were chains that bound the Ottoman world together. Each alliance was less about desire than about geography, less about love than about politics. The Sultan understood this better than anyone. His daughters were not merely his children, they were instruments of statecraft. Where his viziers drew borders on maps, his daughters crossed them in flesh and blood. Through them, he pacified ambitious governors, stitched rebellious provinces to the throne, and ensured that loyalty to the empire was not only written in ink but sealed in bedchambers. And so Ottoman princesses traveled. Some were sent to Anatolia, to fortress cities where the stone walls groaned with the weight of war. Others sailed across the Marmara, their veils fluttering in the sea wind as they left behind the domes of Istanbul, bound for distant shores where their names would be spoken not as daughters of the Sultan but as tokens of his power. They carried with them dowries heavy with silk and gold, but the true gift they brought was themselves. The empire thrived on these bargains. A single marriage could secure a governor's loyalty, prevent the outbreak of rebellion, or tie a wealthy family's fortunes to the throne. To the court, these unions were triumphs, clever strokes of policy that strengthened the Sultan's grasp. But for the women inside them, they were exiles. Once married, few ever returned to the palace of their birth. Their lives became bound to the lands and men they had been given to, their voices swallowed by the duties of wifehood, their bodies pressed into the service of producing heirs who would one day inherit not only titles but debts of loyalty. The people of the empire saw these weddings as spectacles of grandeur. Processions dazzled the streets with jewels and musicians, sermons praised the unions as blessings upon the land, and storytellers embroidered them into tales of harmony and divine will. But beneath the celebration, the reality was far darker. The empire's strength was built on sacrifice, not of soldiers in battlefields, but of women in silken chambers. The princess knew this in her marrow. Each night she spent beside her husband was not just her own submission but the cementing of a political bond. Every glance, every silence, every child she might one day bear would be woven into the fabric of governance. Her body was not her own because it had become geography. Her womb was not her own because it had become succession. Her silence was not her own because it was the echo of treaties whispered across continents. Historians would later describe the Ottoman Empire as one of the greatest powers the world had ever seen, stretching across 3 continents, binding together cultures, faiths, and languages. But they rarely spoke of the women who paid for that greatness. In dusty archives, in half-forgotten letters, one finds traces of their voices, laments for home, prayers for escape, fragments of poetry that speak of longing and despair. These are the invisible foundations of empire, as vital as armies, as enduring as laws. The princess, now wife, now pawn, became one of those foundations. Her suffering was not unique. It was systemic, deliberate, institutional. The empire fed on it as surely as it fed on the taxes of peasants and the blood of soldiers. And though she had once believed her fear was hers alone, she began to understand that it was shared, not only by her sisters and cousins, but by generations of women stretching back to the empire's birth. Her first night had broken her, but the empire demanded more than one night. It demanded a lifetime. Exile did not always look like chains. Sometimes it wore silks, sometimes it glittered with jewels. Yet for the Ottoman princesses scattered across the empire, exile was exile all the same. When a princess left Istanbul, she left more than the familiar courtyards of Topkapi. She left the only place where her name carried undeniable weight. In the capital, she was the daughter of the Sultan, sister to princes, cousin to future rulers. But once she crossed the threshold of her husband's palace in some distant province, her identity shifted. She was no longer a princess in her own right, but the wife of a governor, a trophy that validated his authority, a silent emblem of the Sultan's watchful gaze. The architecture of those provincial palaces mirrored this truth. High walls separated her from the outside world, courtyards trapped her under unfamiliar skies, and servants who did not share her language attended her without the intimacy of kinship. The laughter of Istanbul's women, her sisters, her childhood companions, was replaced by whispers of strangers. Even the air smelled different. In Anatolia, it was dust and stone. In the Balkans, pine and river damp. In Arabia, spice and desert wind. Wherever she went, it was never home. The people around her watched closely. Local subjects saw in her presence a sign that the Sultan's hand was near, that their governor's authority came not from his ambition alone but from blood tied to the throne. For her husband, she was both ornament and insurance. To mistreat her was to risk the Sultan's wrath. To honor her was to strengthen his own prestige. But honor in such marriages was not freedom. It was display. She was paraded in festivals, hidden in harems, invoked in sermons as proof of divine order. And what of love? Rarely did it find space to grow. A husband chosen for politics had little interest in the desires of his bride. At best, he showed courtesy, a detached kindness. At worst, cruelty. Many princesses lived lives of quiet endurance, measuring their days not in joy but in the survival of yet another season, another child born, another letter home that might never be answered. The empire, however, thrived on these sacrifices. A princess married to a provincial governor discouraged rebellion. She made him family, and family was harder to betray. Her sons, should she bear them, tied his bloodline forever to the Sultan's house, blurring the line between ruler and servant. And so, across Anatolia, the Balkans, North Africa, and beyond, Ottoman princesses became living bridges, women whose bodies were transformed into politics, whose wombs were dynasties in miniature. Historians speak of armies that conquered, of treaties that divided, of gold that filled imperial treasuries. But beneath those triumphs, the quietest victories were forged in wedding chambers. The loyalty of a province was often secured not by soldiers at its gates, but by a princess seated in its palace, enduring a marriage she had never chosen. Letters that survive tell of this loneliness. A princess in Aleppo once wrote that she dreamed of the Bosphorus at night, the water's silver curve beneath the moon, the sound of seagulls waking the city. Another, exiled to Bosnia, sent gifts back to Istanbul, silks embroidered with her own tears in the stitching. Their voices remind us that empire was not only the sweep of armies, but the ache of women's hearts. What made this tragedy most cruel was its silence. These women were praised for their obedience, for their dignity, for their ability to endure without complaint. Their suffering became invisible by design. The empire depended on it being so. Their stories were not told in chronicles, their names not celebrated in the poetry of victory. Yet they were there, invisible architects of stability. Their shadows stretched across provinces like invisible chains. The princess we have followed, broken on her wedding night, bound in loyalty she did not choose, now understood herself as part of this greater pattern. Her exile was not singular. It was a tradition, repeated generation after generation. The empire fed on women like her, consuming their hopes in exchange for its strength. And so, as she stood at the edge of her new courtyard, staring at a horizon that would never lead her home, she realized a terrible truth. Empires are not built only on blood spilled in war. They are also built on the silent tears of daughters. History has a cruel way of remembering. It preserves the names of sultans, viziers, and conquerors, etching them into stone, binding them into chronicles, repeating them in classrooms centuries later. But the women who bore the cost of empire, their voices echo faintly, like whispers carried by the wind, easily drowned beneath the noise of triumph. The Ottoman princesses lived and died in shadows. Their marriages may have secured provinces. Their wombs may have birthed heirs who anchored dynasties, but their names rarely outlived them. A treaty bore the Sultan's seal, not the tears of his daughter. A rebellion crushed by loyalty did not honor the woman who made it possible by enduring her wedding night. What empire remembered was the outcome, not the sacrifice. And yet, the legacy of these women is everywhere, hidden in plain sight. In Anatolia, lines of governors claimed legitimacy through their ties to the Sultan's daughters. In North Africa, noble families traced their blood to forgotten princesses, weaving their presence into genealogies. Even in distant villages, the songs of women sometimes carried echoes of laments for brides sent away, never to return. These fragments remind us that the empire's grandeur was not forged only by armies and rulers, but also by women buried beneath silence. Their legacy is not one of triumph, but of endurance. It lives in the poetry of longing, in letters written in trembling hands, in stories whispered across generations. Some were elevated to myths, women said to have defied their husbands, to have longed so fiercely for home that even the stones of their courtyards wept. Whether truth or legend, these tales reveal a hunger to remember what official history erased, that the Ottoman Empire was not built solely on domination, but also on suffering. The question lingers, did they know their sacrifices would be forgotten? As the princess we have followed aged into womanhood, as she raised children who would never see Istanbul, did she realize her story would vanish into the silence of archives, her name dissolved into the folds of history? Or did she hope that someday someone would speak of her, not as a pawn, but as a person? This is the cruelest part of empire. It asks for loyalty, for blood, for silence, and in return, it erases those who give it most. The shadows of legacy are not empty. They are filled with these forgotten lives, lives that deserve to be remembered not as ornaments of statecraft, but as tragedies that made empire possible. Time passed, as it always does, folding centuries into decades, decades into years. Palaces crumbled, governors died, dynasties shifted, and the maps of the Ottoman Empire were redrawn countless times. The laughter of the Bosphorus faded into memory, the echo of ceremonial drums disappeared from the streets, and the silken footsteps of princesses walking to their wedding nights became nothing more than a footnote in dusty scrolls. Yet even as the world changed, their presence lingered, intangible, invisible, but unrelenting. For some princesses, legend softened their memory. Rumors of cleverness, wisdom, and quiet rebellion painted them as figures larger than life. One was said to have outwitted a husband whose ambition threatened the province, another to have preserved her family's influence with a cunning unmatched by any vizier. But these stories, even if true, were always filtered through the empire's gaze. The woman made useful, heroic only if her actions served stability, only if her pain remained concealed. Their true suffering, the terror of the wedding night, the exile, the silence, that remained largely hidden, surviving only in fragments of letters, in half-remembered songs, in whispered tales between women who understood what history forgot. And still, the empire thrived. Cities rose, mosques towered, Minarets sang to the sky, but beneath every success lay the invisible labor of its daughters. Their endurance became a kind of architecture, invisible yet essential, the foundation upon which politics, loyalty, and conquest rested. Each princess sacrificed to alliance, each wedding night endured in silence, was a thread in a web so vast that its pull extended far beyond the marble walls of Istanbul, across rivers, mountains, and seas. The daughter we followed, once a frightened girl in silks, now a woman whose life had been negotiated, measured, and bound, understood her place in this web. Yet even in her quietest hours, she resisted total erasure. She remembered her childhood gardens, the scent of jasmine, the soft glow of lamplight during storytelling nights. She preserved these memories like treasure, fragments of self untouched by the empire. And in that preservation, she discovered a subtle triumph. Though the empire could claim her body and silence her voice in public, it could not erase the depths of her memory, the inner landscapes of her mind, the humanity she carried into exile. Historians may write of empires in terms of conquests and decrees, of power measured in armies and coin. But the truth, the haunting truth, is that every empire is built as much on unseen sacrifices as on celebrated victories. Ottoman princesses, terrified on their first wedding night, exiled across distant lands, endured so that states might endure. Their suffering was not a footnote, it was the mortar. Their silence was not nothing, it was the foundation. And so, centuries later, we speak of them, not as pawns of history but as witnesses to it. We speak of their fear, their endurance, their invisible labor, and their quiet rebellion of memory. The Sultan's daughters remind us that even in the most ornate palaces, under the weight of wealth and power, there are lives marked by fear, by duty, by the relentless demand of survival. And in remembering them, we honor the hidden cost of empire, a cost measured not in gold or banners, but in the trembling hearts of daughters who were given to history in the form of sacrifice. The shadows linger even now, in the hush of a palace corridor, in the rustle of silks, in the whispers of history itself, they are present. The princesses are gone, but their stories remain, tragic, enduring, impossible to forget.